tax evasion. Tax evasion is a universal problem throughout history with manifold economic consequences. Now, hardest hit are the developing countries with evidence that half or more of taxes that could be collected remain uncollected or unaccounted for due to the combination of tax evasion, avoidance, tax exemptions, and corruption. Now, for more on this, we are joined by Jeremy Cape. He's a partner at Dentons. Jeremy, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much.
Now, it would be great to, first of all, for you to start by telling us, what do you think should be done about tax evasion in Africa?
Well, I think one has to be very careful in looking at the question of tax evasion in Africa to know what one means by tax evasion. Quite a lot of the time, terms like tax avoidance, tax planning, tax exemptions get brought into that concept, and that's erroneous. And if people proceed along that route, then there's going to be trouble ahead. What we're looking in terms of tax evasion is where tax is owed, but tax is not paid. And that is clearly a big problem across many countries in Africa. What do you need to do? Well, you need to make individuals and companies feel that they're getting something out of their tax. You need to restrict the amount of waste. You need to eliminate corruption within the government, within the tax authorities, to be able to have stakeholders in the tax system. And you'll find if that's done, then tax compliance will go up. However, you also need to see some simplification of tax rules. A lot of the tax evasion that goes on is actually unintentional. It's the small businesses who see these range of forms that they need to comply with, and these range of payments they need to make frequently, and without expensive advice by accountants and lawyers, they're not going to be able to comply. So they end up not paying taxes, not because they're intending to evade, but just because they can't comply.
Now, someone we spoke to yesterday said that we need to start putting some of these tax evaders in jail. Do you think that we need to get to that level? You
do. No, I mean, it is clear, and you've seen it in the United States. There have been some high-profile prosecutions. Lauryn Hill of the Fugees, Wesley Snipes, the actor, have both spent time in prison. Yes, you need to go after the big tax evaders and be very public in the way those people are prosecuted. But equally, one has to be careful. And this goes back to my original point about being aware of what's meant by tax evasion. What you don't want to be doing is making life hell for the small businessman who's trying to grow, he's trying to be an entrepreneur, he's trying to make Nigeria or wherever it is into a better, richer country, and will make some mistakes. You can't have an incentivization structure for tax officials to go after that entrepreneur. You need to go for the big guys.
Now, very interesting point here. We hear that we're losing more in unpaid taxes than we're actually getting in foreign aid. So surely that needs to change. But how can we change that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I hear that mention, and this goes back to my original point. I think sometimes there is confusion about the amount of tax that is lost every year. And sometimes I see reports, whether in Africa or back in the UK, back in the US, that talk about that multinational enterprises are avoiding tax by using structures to go in. Well, that's not the case at all. I mean, there is a reason that investments are made through Mauritius, through the UK, through the Netherlands from time to time. That's completely above board and necessary for those investments to work. But yes, it is true that as Africa transitions from where it was 20, 30 years ago to the place that it is today, one is going to need to reassess the tax base in order to broaden that, to bring more people within it, but then to reduce rates at the same time.
At the same time, we hear there's also a lack of information that's available to taxpayers on tax compliance. What do you think about that?
Well, my experience of Nigeria is that tax compliance is fairly tough, and I think the PwC report from a few days ago bore that. I mean, it's a shame because Nigeria's tax rates and tax take is actually quite on the low side, which is the starting point for investors outside and within Nigeria.
So what's the problem for Nigeria? Because that report you mentioned that we have it takes a long time to make some of these tax payments, a number of tax payments, and the time to comply. Is that the problem for Nigeria? Is that specific to Nigeria as well?
Well, I mean, you see it across the world. Nigeria, of course, given its size and because it has the local, state, federal taxes, naturally has a more complex system than many other countries. But I think some imagination, some bold steps, and Nigeria should be doing it now. If you leave it 10 years, it will be too late. Now, when the economy is booming, I mean, I'm here for the CBO Investors Conference. I've been here for 3 days, and I'm seeing far more activity than I'm seeing elsewhere in the world. It's now that the bold steps need to be taken, because you could find yourself in the position, the UK, where our tax legislation is very, very complex, and it's hard to change it, because when an economy is stagnating, you don't have the same political will to make the changes. Some people will be worse off when you simplify a tax system. Some people will be better off. The problem is the people who are worse off tend to shout more than the people who are better off. But if everyone is getting better off, then you can make those changes now. So I think it's absolutely key for some firm leadership on these changes.
How do we compare to other West African countries, maybe in Ghana, for example?
Well, I think Ghana, in terms of the compliance and the number of tax payments that need to be made, is a lot better. I mean, I don't know if there are any African jurisdictions which do it, but given the way in which mobile telephony has been used to make payments, to make transfers between bank accounts, has anyone invented an app whereby one can make tax payments using mobile phones? I mean, it should be that sort of thing where Africa really does lead the world. It could teach us a thing or two in the UK about how we should do it.
Perhaps, in terms of training, lack of manpower, skilled manpower, inadequate funding, those are some of the problems we face here as well.
Yes, the reality is that there does need to be extensive funding of the tax administration. And in fact, whilst it's a very different country, look at what Burundi has done in terms of its reform under a guy named Kieran Holmes, who has reformed the revenue authority there beyond all recognition and has had a corresponding massive increase in tax revenues.
Now, something you mentioned there, I must pick up on that point. How do we strike a balance between raising tax revenues and encouraging growth? Because you mentioned some of these small businesses, for example.
Yeah, I mean, there needn't necessarily be a conflict between the two. I mean, let's take the example. What has historically happened is that when you have, say, a guy who sells mobile phone cards, he doesn't really have a base. He's just a street vendor. The idea is there's no point taxing him because his income is too low. But if you can bring him in a small way into the tax net, he's then got to keep accounts. If he has accounts, he can get funding, he can get insurance, he can take on employees, he can grow. So in fact, yes, of course there is a bit of a conflict. You don't want to overtax. Yeah. You don't want to overtax.
We need to educate those people as well, because those people don't even understand, what we're talking about.
And again, it affects the relationship between the taxpayer and the tax administration. It shouldn't be one of conflict. Obviously, from time to time, there is going to be one. And I'm a lawyer, so of course, I love there being a little bit of conflict from time to time. But generally, it should be seen as a relationship which coexists for the good both of the tax authority and of the taxpayer. And I passionately believe this, and I see it happening in practice when I'm regularly in Africa.
Jeremy, let's leave it there. Thank you for sharing your view on tax in Africa. That's Jeremy Cape. He's a partner at Dent.